If there's nothing else, let's turn to strange agents. This is going to be a weird one. I think this is a weird one. Bracket complementary. I think that's good. So, just to briefly review, we talked about these ascent criteria for sentience way back in the beginning, and recall that like half of them were specifically neurological. They were about your neurons and how your neurons are arranged, like possession of integrative brain regions. Plants kind of fall right off of this. Plants don't get to pass that criteria just because they don't have brain regions. We also talked about, however, so if you recall, there was this no cortex, no cry argument. That is, you don't have to, fish don't have any feelings because you don't have to, it's okay to eat fish because they don't have any feelings, to quote Nirvana. That's because we process pain in our neocortex, the big lumpy bit at the front of our brains. Fish don't have neocortexes, so they don't have pain. That was the no cortex, no cry argument. And we immediately said, that's probably not a very good argument because of multiple realizability. Quite plausibly, there's a bunch of different ways to process pain in a kind of global, coherent, sentient way, right? If octopi have radically different brains than us, you can imagine robots that could do this. You could imagine aliens on another planet that don't have anything like our neuroanatomy, but nonetheless have sentience. So multiple realizability was one of the replies to this. We also talked about putting some doubt on the kind of neurological bias of those ascent criteria. We also talked about plant cognition, and we did see them do I thought it was impressive stuff. I don't know how impressed you were. I was impressed when I look at plant cognition. I'm like, that's cool. That's cool that you can do that. I thought you just grew. I thought you just sat there and grew, but you're doing stuff. They have no nervous system whatsoever, but they're implementing these things. Sometimes it's clear enough how they implement complex behaviors. Sometimes it's not obvious. We talked about the leaf shape mimicry, and I believe it remains an open question how they manage that. And very last time we talked about personhood of rivers. This is in this context of this legal debate about whether can you consider a river a person. And one of the things that came up in our discussion was this question of responsibility. Like personhood typically comes with this idea that you are responsible for your action. Not only do people have obligations towards you, but you have obligations towards people. And doesn't that assume a kind of agency or intelligence or something like that? So we've had at least three. So we got the ascent stuff where like, are neurons relevant? We've got plants where it's like, they look like they're doing complicated, maybe not sentient, but maybe intelligent stuff. And then we talked about rivers where it's like, can you call that an agent? Is it reasonable to think of that as possibly an agent? So this week, those are all gonna come together and we're gonna ask some fairly foundational questions about cognition, intelligence, agency, that kind of stuff. What does it mean to say something is an agent or is intelligent? And can something like a single-celled organism that absolutely has no nervous system, a nervous system is a collection of cells, one cell can't have that, can they do things like have memory or problem solve? Can they do some of the sort of stuff that's cognitive? That's our topic. And our reading for this week it's called On Having No Head by Belushka and Levin, 2016. Cognition throughout biological systems. So the argument is something like when you look at how brains work, you can actually see very, very deep evolutionary roots of those mechanisms. And in fact, many of the same mechanisms that neurons use to process, we all agree that neurons process information. They're doing some kind of, it may be metaphorically, but like neurons process information, completely uncontroversial. And they do it using electricity mostly, chemical and electrical signaling. Is that uncontroversial? I haven't looked at neuroscience super deeply lately, but last I recall, chemical signals, electrical signals. And the argument here is something like, when you look at other types of cell, you see those same mechanisms. You see electrical signaling, you see chemical signaling. Quite often, it's the same chemicals. It's the same like neurotransmitters in different parts of the body. And that the fancy tricks that the brain does to process information are actually grounded in much, much older mechanisms that also do something like problem solving. They have memory, there's memory and problem solving, a kind of goal-directedness in basically all living things. That's the claim. So cognition, you might say, cognition is all over the darn place. Cognition we typically reserve for higher animals, big complex animals. 11 complains that we're very good at detecting agency and intelligence when something looks like us and acts on timescales like us, but he proposes that we're actually very bad at it in any other context. So, which means something like, the kind of scientific consequence of that is you can use tools from like behavioral neuroscience, the same tools that we use to understand the brain can be used, he argues, to understand things like how embryos develop, or how tissues regenerate, or how colonies of animals work together towards common goals. And then the main takeaway they want us to have is cognition is everywhere. This is the claim, and then alongside that, supporting that, is the idea that bioelectricity, electrical gradients between cells, is a kind of cognitive glue that sticks together the little agents that are our cells into larger agents. So cells are using the same basic mechanisms as neurons to do cognitive work. Okay, let me put a warning label on all of this. This is new science. This is very new science. So this guy is Mike. This is Michael Levin. I'm sorry to Belushka. I'm mostly going to be talking about Levin's views because he's been building this case in the scientific literature and actually mountains of stuff on YouTube. I came across this guy on YouTube. He's got just like dozens and dozens of hours of videos where he's arguing for this stuff. But he's a developmental biology professor at Tufts. He's not just a random guy. He's making this case, and it's not settled. I would say it's not settled science. So I'm offering you one guy's view. He's a working biologist. It's not just a rando, but this is a scientific proposal that I certainly wouldn't put the same level of certainty on as like more basic. This isn't textbook stuff yet. These are claims being made by this guy and a group of collaborators that are in the process of being tested. He's I don't know. He might be a kook. He might be a kook. I don't know. I leave it to you to evaluate. I don't think he's disreputable, and I'm certain he's not a grifter. I know he believes this stuff, or I'm very confident he believes this stuff. But it is like he's got a very strong view and a very controversial view of a whole bunch of issues and how they connect to each other. And I'm not enough of a biologist to evaluate his work scientifically. We might push back philosophically. So one of the questions that will sort of hopefully wrap all of this in is, like, is his use of the words like intelligence or cognition? I'll show you a bunch of examples that he says, this is intelligence. And I want you to ask yourself, like, is that an appropriate use of the word intelligence? Is that enough to say that the system is intelligent, or is it doing cognition or something like that? We can say that it's doing clever and interesting stuff, clever in scare quotes or something like that, but is it intelligence? So there's a philosophical side of it, and then there's the empirical side of it, which I think the only way to test that is the scientific method. You get a whole bunch of people to run the same experiments and test it out and see what happens. So the scientific side of this is unresolved as of yet. I think it's an interesting and active kind of like area of research. Don't take it to the bank, but like, and also, I mean, this guy does have like a biotech startup that he's trying to get going. He thinks this stuff has useful clinical applications. So he's got some money on it. Just, I don't know how that affects your evaluation of it, but something maybe to keep in mind. Yeah. And then the philosophy stuff, I think we can kick around. We are qualified to ask ourselves, are the examples he's providing genuine intelligence or not? Okay, so by way of proviso, this is controversial. This is on the bleeding edge of things, and it is unsettled. Okay, so cognition is everywhere, he says. Cognition is all over the place. You can see it at many, many different scales in biology. The problem is that we usually think of problem solving, something like problem solving is, our walking around and using our hands in 3D space to like make a tool or use a tool or unlock something or whatever, right? We think of problem solving as moving around in sort of like our lived world. He wants to propose that there are other types of problem and that we can see the roots of our own neural problem-solving abilities in much, much older, evolutionarily, much, much older processes. So here's a problem that we have all solved. Go from being a fertilized egg to being an adult. Well, some of you. More to varying degrees. We're all in this process. We made it as far as being old enough to come to university, and that is in some sense a problem. Well, it's a question. How do cells of an embryo know how to arrange themselves into an adult? What's the anybody biologist in the room? What's the standard story about that? It's probably long and complicated. That's probably too much to ask you. How do they know? You're like 32 cells in a clump. How do they figure out how to arrange themselves into first like an embryo and then an adult? Okay, so that's fair enough. No, what do you mean you're not up on modern embryology? Geez. Okay, so the standard story is something like there is a genetic program. There is a program in the genes that tell various parts what to do and how to do it. Somehow the genes just have the answer pre-specified. But that doesn't actually turn out to be at least not the complete story. So thinking about this as a problem, so thinking about embryonic development as a problem-solving activity, what happens when you push an embryo off of its normal starting line? So this is normalized shape and location of perturbed craniofacial structures in the xenopus tadpole reveal an innate ability to achieve correct morphology. Okay, here's a 2012 study. They created what they called Picasso tadpoles. Picasso painting where the features are all kind of weirdly rearranged. They made some tadpoles using, they sort of like chemically scrambled their little faces up. They introduced some chemicals into the kind of like embryo stage that caused their little tadpole faces to be all weird. Eyes and nose and mouth in strange and unusual locations. So if your genes just program if there's a straightforward hardwired program of what for each cell to do, it's hard to see how these strange scrambled up faces would develop into a fairly normal adult, but they do. They do. So you chemically scramble the embryo's face, and then it more or less develops into this. The eyes they move around, the mouth moves around, the jaw reshapes itself to become a fairly normal adult. Normal is a distribution anyway, so it's normal-ish. That's weird, right? That's weird. There's a problem. There's a problem to be solved. In some sense, there is a goal to be achieved, which is the standard kind of like frog face. You're looking to get a frog face. You're a tadpole. Your goal is produce a frog. And if natural selection acted on genes which encode a program, if you put random messed up data if you give a bunch of you go into an Excel spreadsheet and just like add ones and zeros at random, it's not going to like figure out how to turn that back into a spreadsheet, right? A strictly mechanical process that just goes through the motions is not going to be able to take a bunch of really weird input and figure out how to get back to the goal state. You might be able to do that though. An intelligent agent can take a very odd or non-standard starting point, say, I'm going to go make lunch, and your roommate says, aha, I have hidden all of the lunch ingredients around the apartment, and you have to go find them from the various hiding places. First of all, you say, I'm moving, that's it. But then, because you're hungry, you would go to a bunch of non-standard locations and find the ingredients for your lunch and put it together. Maybe after calling your landlord and making some arrangements. But like, you can do that, right? Because you're intelligent. So, embryonic development as problem solving. The idea is, so we're used to thinking about problem solving as moving around, usually in physical space. You have the making lunch problem, and then you go through your kitchen and collect some ingredients and put them together in some sensible fashion. But that's just one of the spaces that you might think of in terms of problem solving in. Here's another space, a morpho space. This isn't Levin's term. This is sort of like from developmental biology and evolutionary biology. Morphospace is just sort of the space of all possible ways a body could be arranged. Evolution explores morphospace on kind of like evolutionary time scales over hundreds of thousands of generations. You see species moving around in the space of possible ways that bodies could be. And Levin suggests that embryos are problem solving in morphospace in a single generation. So you give the embryo the Picasso face that it didn't want to start with, but you do, and then it finds its way through morphospace to its goal state of being a functional adult, most of the time. All right. Okay, so Levin likes to frequently cite this definition of intelligence from the psychologist William James. Intelligence is a fixed goal with a variable means of achieving it. Intelligence is a fixed goal with a variable means of achieving it. If I drop a rock, it just drops. It does not, if it's got, my wallet wants to fall to the ground, but if it falls on the table, it doesn't go around the table, right? It's not changing its behavior in order to get around obstacles to move towards its goal. If it did, I think that would be really weird and eerie, but you might want to go like, oh, that looks smart. That object is doing intelligence somehow, because you can see that it's got a goal, and you can see that if you put an obstacle in its way, it's going around that obstacle. So the argument goes something like, it's easy to assume that embryonic development is a hardwired program put there by natural selection. It's easy to believe that it is not goal-directed, and therefore not. So in this definition of intelligence, your goal-directed is one prerequisite, but also having a kind of variety of ways of achieving that goal is the other. And if you don't scramble up some tadpole faces, you never get to find out whether it's goal-directed or not. It might just be a process that goes the same every time. It just sort of runs through the motions. But if you perturb it off of its usual starting point, put some obstacle in the way of the goal, and then you can watch it change what it normally does to get back to that goal, you might call that intelligence. Yeah. So this is the kind of definition of intelligence that Levin uses. This is the philosophically controversial bit, though. So if you were one of Levin's opponents, and he says, look, Picasso tadpoles, they rearrange their faces to make normal frog faces. That is intelligent behavior, because intelligence is a fixed goal with variable means of achieving it. Tadpole development has that. Therefore, those cells have intelligence. If you were trying to give Levin a hard time about that, what would be a good thing to say to him? He says, this is the definition of intelligence that makes sense in this context. Come on, someone give him a hard time. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, like think of like you Goldberg machine, in which you have like a marble that falls down, some contraption goes to an end.
Yep.
You could just argue that in the case of the tadpole, there's the marble at the beginning that has the fixed goal at the end.
Yep.
But there are variable different chutes it can go down such that it gets to the end.
Yeah.
And when you manipulate the morphology of the tadpole, all you're really doing is just shooting down another chute.
Good.
It just means it's intelligent. It just means that there's multiple prescribed pathways.
Good, excellent, yeah. So you can easily imagine what you're describing there is just a simple, unintelligent mechanism that just has more than one way that it can go. Suppose the thermostat in your house, so trying to maintain a given temperature. Suppose it's cold out and you've got a good old-fashioned, natural gas heater, and you've got a heat pump. Those are two ways to raise the temperature in your house. And sometimes it uses the natural gas, and sometimes it uses the heat pump. Maybe just flips a coin, which one. It doesn't have to do something really smart to choose which one it is. Just having more than one way of getting to the fixed goal of making your house room temperature. Is that intelligence? I don't know. So this is the pushback. This is the pushback that you might get. People who criticize this say, yeah, okay, so Levin, you're showing that there's maybe even information processing going on in places where we wouldn't have expected, but it's a little much to call it intelligence. That's too much, maybe. It's certainly not. I mean, what you usually mean by intelligence is like somebody's like knows a lot about the world, is good in a variety of situations. I don't know. It seems like a really rich word to be using for scrambled up tadpole faces, getting to where they were going. Now, I'll talk about the response that Levin has a bit later. So I think there's things that's the pushback. There's things he can say in response. Let's do some more examples and a bit more stuff. So, okay. So, or should we take a break? Yeah. You all right for a little bit more? Okay. So, he's got this fairly stripped down notion of intelligence, cognition, just sort of using intelligence. And the argument is that you can see that if you accept that those are reasonable definitions of intelligence, cognition, goal-directedness, all that, you can see this at a bunch of different sort of scales in biology. So, this is a diagram he's used in a few different papers. You can see this, he claims, in genetic networks. So, a gene regulatory network. You know that your genes are not all sort of on all at the same time, right? Every cell in your body has all of the same genes. Some of them make liver cells, some of them make skin cells. What's the difference? It's which parts of the genome are most transcribed or most active, right? And within the genome, some genes regulate other genes. They activate or deactivate the transcription of other genes. And these connections form these networks called gene regulatory networks. Is this familiar? All right, that's the short version of this. He claims, I'm not going to go into this one, but he claims that you can see some problem solving, some intelligence at the level of gene regulatory networks. We spent some time worrying about whether whole plants can be intelligent. He's telling us parts of a single cell can have intelligence. And then one cell all by itself can do stuff that's intelligent. The cytoskeleton here is the kind of like the cell holds itself together with some like fairly rigid parts inside, like a skeleton. And his suggestion is, and that cytoskeleton is constantly making and remaking itself. It's not sort of rigid. It's a fairly active object within the cell. His suggestion is that the cytoskeleton might have some capacity for, so memory here just kind of means like some change in the thing that is based on something that's happened to it that can then cause new things to happen in the future. He's using the word memory and he applies it to the cytoskeleton. Okay, so neural networks, we're all happy with this one, right? Nobody's like, neural networks, those don't process, and for those that can't have intelligence, that's the one we're familiar with. He thinks whole tissues and organs, so that's the embryonic development one we just saw. Whole organisms, again, I think it's fine to say whole organisms can be intelligent. That's not controversial. Colonies as well. That one people seem to be okay with. The idea that an ant colony has a kind of emergent intelligence is relatively uncontroversial, actually. I think we're more comfortable with it when it's like a bunch of things that themselves are intelligent have an even more intelligent collection. That people seem to be pretty fine with that. But the argument is you see kind of goal-directed intelligent behavior at every one of these levels is the idea. Okay. And then each one of those levels, so you got little cells that are doing intelligent stuff. Those cells make up tissues that are themselves doing intelligent stuff. Those tissues make up organisms. Those organisms sometimes make up colonies and groups. So what we have here is a picture of a kind of hierarchy of a bunch of little agents that make up slightly larger agents that make up slightly larger agents, and so on. But then the question is, how do you coordinate all those little tiny agents into big agents? And the claim is bioelectricity is one of the important ways that this happens. Okay, so this is one of the points where I get a little worried about our friend Michael. He gets a little bit excited about bioelectricity and seems to think that it is the method of coordinating, collective group intelligences and collections of agents. I think it's certainly, everybody agrees that bioelectricity is like one of the important mechanisms in your brain. So everybody agrees that it's got crucial roles to play in the kinds of intelligence we're sure exist. I think he might get a little excited about it and maybe attribute a little too much. It becomes this sort of like magic solvent for him that explains kind of everything. But I think he's got some really, really interesting examples. I think he's got good reasons to get excited. Whether he is the exact correct amount of excited is one of those scientific questions that we'll have to see how this works out. But so bioelectricity, that is just kind of voltages. So nervous systems, the idea is do something very quickly and efficiently. Nervous systems use a trick, which is doing information processing using differences in voltage that every cell knows and has known for a very long time. I'll quickly do this and then because this is bonkers. So I'll do this and we'll take a break. Okay, so this is a planarian. A planarian is a bunch of different species of like tiny little flatworms. This is Dugessia japonica, and it's got this very interesting property that if you chop it up into bits, each bit regenerates the whole flatworm. And it's especially interesting because it's got a brain, like it's got a kind of centralized. If we're doing our ascent criteria on this little guy, having a kind of centralized bit of the nervous system, the planaria have that. I swear these are actual microscope pictures. They're not like cartoons. They've got these weird those are eye spots, those two little dots, and they look so goofy, but those are real. They can't move them around, but they have eye spots. Anyway. So crazy that they can, I think that's wild that these things, you chop them in half and they make two perfectly good adult flatworms. And you might, that should by itself give you pause. So you chop it exactly in half, and there's a front end and a back end. How does the front end know to grow a back end and the back end know to grow a front end?
Better used.
How does it do that? This is a big coordination problem. This is in some sense a problem-solving question. So regeneration, just like embryonic development, a bunch of cells have to kind of all get on the same page and reconstruct an organism, and they have to do it right. First of all, they have to know what to do and then when to stop. You cut off the back end, you cut it in half, and the front end just starts growing a tail that just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. This is a bad outcome. It needs to know how much of a tail to regrow. How does it know that? So the proposal is bioelectricity. So Nogi and Levin, 2005. So there's on the planarian body, there's a kind of a voltage gradient. I don't remember which it is, but like imagine the front is a little more positively charged than the back, something like that. And you can alter that by injecting stuff that, there's a few different ways, but like suppose you give put some mRNA that upregulates ion channels, so causing it to change the way that the voltage is expressed in the cells. So you alter there's an electrical gradient across the planarian, and you chemically alter that so that it's got the normal signal of a head in both its head and its tail. And when you do that, first off, nothing really happens. It's fine. It's a normal flatworm. It squiggles around and is a flatworm. But if you cut it in half, then it grows a head where its tail used to be. So the pitch is that bioelectric gradient was a sort of map of where all its parts are supposed to be, and it uses that to do the regeneration. And if you alter that map, so that map sets the sort of goal state for the flatworm. Here's how your body's supposed to be shaped. And if you get divergences like that, say somebody chops off your tail, you try to reconstruct according to that map. And if you alter that map, you can alter the way it regenerates. And these little guys will sort of swim around and have a life. So this has been seen for quite some time. For more than 100 years, people have been studying these things, and they've seen two-headed flatworms. There's a bunch of ways of creating two-headed flatworms. Altering this kind of chemical gradient or electrical gradient isn't the only one. Here's a weird one, though. If you take one of these two-headed guys and chop it in half, both of them will regenerate as a two-headed flatworm. So there's no genetic change here. All of the genes across all of these flatworms are absolutely identical. They're literally clones of each other. But if you do this change in the electrical gradient on one, it will, every time you chop it, regrow a head where its tail used to be. A radical change of form with no genetic change. And the idea is the bioelectric field is what tells all of the cells how they're supposed to be working together to make a body. That's the pitch. Huh? I don't know.
What?
We were talking about two-headed worms and how you can get them by changing the kind of bioelectric gradient across a planarian and then cutting it in half. Turns out you can do a bunch of stuff by manipulating these bioelectric gradients. So there's a kind of typical pattern on, say, the face of a tadpole, and there's sort of typical bioelectric patterns that are where the eyes will grow. And as it turns out, if you induce those patterns in other parts of the tadpole, like on its back, an eye will grow there. An eye will grow there, which is very strange. It's like the bioelectric field is setting the goal state for the overall collective of cells. And so what they're doing is sort of like injecting a little bit of mRNA into a region, and cells will get the idea that, oh, I'm supposed to be an eye, and they'll actually start recruiting nearby cells that didn't have the mRNA injected into them. So there's a few that are like, hey, everybody, we're making an eye. And then the nearby cells will say, I thought we were making a back. And then they'll say, no, it's an eye. And they'll start sort of recruiting nearby cells to construct a fairly normal eye in the middle of its back. That's wild. That's wild. And again, no genetic change. It's just changing the sort of like bioelectric properties, the ion channels and gap junctions, if you're curious. Okay, so there's a map that specifies. The claim is that there's a map, bioelectric map. The nice thing about bioelectricity is it's a way of connecting up cells in a kind of holistic way. The pattern of charge goes across the whole organism. It's not like you have to have one cell talking to another cell from a long distance away using chemical signals. So cells seem to have some sense of where they are in the body. A cell is not all that smart. It's not got a brain, it's not got a nervous system, but somehow it seems to have signals. This is based on work from the 50s. So you take a bit of an amphibian's tail. Amphibians are really good regenerators. They can regrow limbs and tails and stuff like that. And so you graft a bit of tail onto the side of this paper, transformation of a tail into a limb or gill-like structures. There's a few different species of amphibians. And that tail will slowly remodel itself into a limb. It'll start growing fingers. Real David Lynch body horror stuff, but like, it's extremely strange. And the strangest thing about this, so this is an example Levin likes to cite. Think about the very tip of that grafted on tail. Its local environment is perfectly normal. The cells there are saying, I'm the tip of a tail. What I expect to see is the next bit of the tail, and it does. Its local neighbors are tail bits. So from the perspective of the very tip, the part that remodels itself, its local environment is normal and fine. It's getting its normal kind of like it's getting blood flow from the rest of the body. It's in the right kind of species. It's around the kind of cells it expects to be around. Somehow it's getting signals from the rest of the body. Hey, you're not on a butt. You're on the side. Make a limb, and they do. This is a level of modularity that, well, just like how much. So amphibians are more like this than us. We're really not all that good at regenerating bits that have been chopped off. If you lose a hand, you're out of luck. Apparently, if you lose just the very, very end of your fingertip, it will grow back. Little kids and infants can lose much more of their fingertip, and that will still grow back. Somehow we lose that ability. But amphibians are really good at sort of like regenerating bits, and they will do really wild stuff like this. The argument is, Levin thinks he's got an explanation for how they do this. You look at this and you go, how the hell do you do that? They did not in the 1950s have a very clear hypothesis for how this was supposed to work. Levin thinks, here's the answer. There is a bioelectric field, a kind of an electrical gradient that tells the body which parts are supposed to be where. The goal state for if it's going to do wound healing or regeneration or just continue to make the parts. And if you graft a tip of a tail onto the side of an amphibian, it, using kind of like the global electrical field of the organism, figures out, I'm supposed to be an arm. More like an arm than a tail. Okay, start making a tail. That's so weird. Okay, to sum up, the overall kind of argument is the bioelectric pattern set a kind of cellular goal state. It's a picture of the animal, how the animal is supposed to be shaped, drawn in patterns of positive and negative charge. And if you redraw these patterns and then do injury, it will reshape how they change. If you mix something, if you induce a new pattern in a developing tadpole, it will induce changes to how the whole thing develops. So cells are working on this kind of collective problem solving of attaining and maintaining the sort of fixed point that they're trying to get to, having the kind of like normal shaped body, and then you can sort of manipulate the fixed goal state by manipulating the pattern of bioelectricity in the body. That's his claim. Note that is an interpretation. So I've showed you the results of a few experiments. There's no sort of law of logic that says this is the only way to interpret those experiments. That's not a given, but it's his proposal, and he seems to be getting some promising consequences out of it. Okay, so little agents working together to try to get to goal states, those goal states specified by bioelectric fields. So bioelectricity, he calls it a kind of cognitive glue that fits little agents together into a larger agent. Okay, so distinguish, we've already talked about intelligence. Distinguish simple, unintelligent goal directedness. Those two bits of the magnet, the north and south poles of a magnet are, for the sake of argument, this is an extremely stripped down notion of goal directedness. They're just trying to get together. But if you put something in their way, then they don't do that. They're not going to go around. Intelligence is a sort of middle area where if you put something in the way of the little agent trying to get to its goal, it will redirect and go another way. So the variable means to get to a fixed goal. So call that intelligence. We can then think about what you might call collective intelligence. When a bunch of agents are held together by some kind of cognitive glue, they might well be able to do fancier things than any of the individual agents can do. So I don't think any individual cell has a map of what the whole organism is supposed to look like. I don't think any individual neuron is all that bright. No individual neuron can do calculus. Somehow they work together to achieve this larger goal. He talks about cognitive light cones. So like your light cone in physics is like all the stuff that's close enough that you could physically interact with it. So it as you know, moving at the speed of light, how far could the signals from your life go? It's and then we think of that in some sense as a cognitive metaphor for that. Given the kind of agent you are, what's the most complex goal you can imagine participating in? You're a cell. You can be a cell and cell around. You probably can't imagine having the goal of, I would like to pass my midterm. Your individual cells can't have a goal that complex, but you can. And somehow those individual cells get put together in a larger agent. So a bunch of little agents merge together into a larger agent via cognitive glue. And you get something like collective intelligence. Okay, so we can see collective intelligence in a bunch of different systems. Multicellular organisms are obviously the most advanced form of this. So all of your cells are working together to pursue your goals. But you can see it in so-called single-celled organisms too. So bacteria have been seen to cooperate. Here's the scenario. When food is plentiful, bacteria are very often sort of free-floating individuals. They just sort of like run around and eat and multiply. But when food is scarce, they will form what's called a biofilm. So a whole bunch of bacteria sort of like squish together. They band together to survive the hard times. A biofilm. That's why you got to floss, because you get biofilms on your teeth. I don't know if you've ever tried to live in a society, but it has some ups and downs, right? The desires of the individual are sometimes pitted against what the good of the collective. So you would like, an individual might I'd like to go take all of the money and stuff. I'd just like to take your stuff. That would be good for me as an individual. But if society allows everybody to do that, then the whole society collapses. So social goods weighed against individual goods. And you can see some of that kind of tension in a bacterial biofilm. So distinguish two kind of groups in the biofilm. There's the bacteria on the outside of the film, and then there's the bacteria protected on the inside. And they've got kind of different goals and different interests. The outside of the biofilm, you're under the most threat from, say, something that's going to come along and eat you, or a nasty chemical that's going to burn you. But you also have the best access to food. So the bacteria on the outside have the sort of high risk, high reward. If something's going to come along and kill a bunch of you, you're the first to go, but you're also the first to get food as it comes. So food has to sort of filter through the biofilm to get to the ones on the inside. The ones on the inside are protected, relatively protected by the outside of the film, but they get less access to food. But you need the ones on the inside as well, because if something happens to the one, if the ones on the outside just let the ones on the inside starve to death, then the first little thing that happens kills the whole colony. So you need the colony as a whole needs the ones on the inside as a kind of like reserve against injury or destruction or whatever. So the colony as a unified thing needs the outside for protection and the inside for like regeneration when necessary. The ones on the outside they have an interest in feeding and reproducing, of course, as all living things do. As all bacteria. Reproducing is a mixed bag. I've enjoyed it, but I don't know if I recommend it to everybody. Sorry, that's neither here nor there. In the interest of the ones on the inside is to, like, you can't just give up the ones on the inside, or else the colony as a whole has no robustness. It can't reproduce. So what you see is a kind of right down? Yeah. A kind of oscillation. So you'll see the overall biofilm go through waves of feeding and reproduction and then kind of like resting. And during the resting, so the ones on the outside sort of feed and reproduce themselves. They got to keep going. But sometimes they take it easy and let food sort of filter into the ones on the inside. So the kind of oscillation of feeding and reproducing and then quiescence, feeding and reproducing and then quiescence. And that lets both groups get what they need to survive, and both groups benefit from their kind of like the outside ones protect the inside ones replace the outside ones. Inside ones sound like the better deal. Sort of, I don't know, a little bit hungry but safe. I don't know. Okay, so so this biofilm is acting as a kind of collective. Even though they're single-celled organisms, their mutual interests seem to be served by acting in a coordinated fashion. This solution, this kind of oscillating feeding and then resting, feeding and then resting, requires that everybody be on the same page. You have to be coordinated for this to work. If one of the outside bacteria just goes, I'm just going to eat all the time, screw you, inside bacteria, then it doesn't work. So everybody needs to be coordinated for the good of the whole. And it seems like the way they coordinate with each other is bioelectric signals. That's one hypothesis for how they're doing this. So bacterial cooperation in biofilms, it looks like they're using bioelectric signals these are separate organisms. Like if you take one of these things out, if you take one of my cells out, it just dies pretty fast. But if you took one of these bacteria out, it would be perfectly fine living in a nutrient-rich, safe environment. It would happily grow and reproduce. But they seem to coordinate their activities, acting in a coordinated fashion, bound together by these bioelectric and chemical signals. You can interpret some of the problems that we have as failures of this type of cooperation. So, I mean, every one of your cells needs to make a living, as it were. It needs to get along. It needs to have enough nutrients and enough sort of safety to continue to survive. Sometimes, though, some of your cells get a little greedy. One way of thinking about cancer is as cells no longer cooperating with each other for the good of the organism, they start to reproduce out of like what if I just considered only myself and not the health of the organism? I'm just going to keep growing and reproducing, and yes, like it'll kill you eventually. Well, most of the time. So one way of reading this is in terms of a failure of cooperation. Some cells sort of regress to their pre-multicellular state before our many cells kind of all got on the same page and start acting as though they are self-interested individuals again. So, and then the cognitive glue hypothesis suggests that you can, and experimentally, there's some evidence to show, you can induce tumors by disrupting the kind of bioelectric communication between cells. So you cause it to, by cutting off the connection to bioelectric sort of like coordination between cells, you can cause a tumor to grow. Your cells will quite happily start acting self-interestedly if they are not put in tune with other cells all the time. And furthermore, you can treat a tumor by reconnecting. So what's happened in a tumor is a group of cells has stopped talking to the other cells, is stopped coordinating with them on their global projects, and you can treat those by reconnecting them. So using chemicals to sort of chemically inducing the kind of reconnection of those bioelectric coordination dynamics, and you can treat them. Yeah.
Is that something that he's tried, or is this just a theory?
Yes, he's tried it. Yes. Okay, so he's tried it in some types of tumor in some organisms.
Not in humans.
I think that's the biotech startup is he's trying to develop it in humans. It's a pretty long road to get approval to try something weird in humans. But that is the goal, and he's done it in some other model organisms. He claims to have done it. Again, so now we're into the area where he has a direct financial interest in us all believing that he can do this, so we should tread a little bit carefully. But he's published papers where you put some oncogenes, so there's genes that are associated with, when they do cancer research, they very often genetically modify some mice with oncogenes that makes them very, very likely to produce cancer. So you get some of the nastiest oncogenes you can and put them into a model organism. It grows a tumor, and then you sort of like chemically alter, so stuff like using mRNA to alter the number of ion channels and the expression of ion channels, and that solves the tumor. This is the claim. And so there's some like, I think there are genuinely important and interesting philosophical questions about like, is this really, is this all really as neat and simple as you want to make it sound and all that stuff? But if this guy cures cancer, I'll let him, he can talk however he wants. If he figures out how to cure cancer with no radiation or chemo, then he's just right. He's as right as I could possibly want him to be about this stuff. He hasn't done that yet. I note that cancer is still a thing. So we're not there yet, but supposing that he does, then yeah, then great. The claims here are not insubstantial. So this guy has huge amounts of like press and podcasts, and he's throwing up mountains of material on YouTube. Here's a interview with UChicago. He says, pretty much everything, birth defects, traumatic injury, aging, degenerative disease, cancer, all of these things boil down to the problem of a group of cells not knowing how or not being able to build the right thing. If you have the answer to this, how do you communicate an anatomical goals to a collection of cells? You could fix all of these things. That's the claim. That should make you nervous. That should make you a little nervous. With the scale of it. I find it intriguing. I'm certainly going to follow this sort of research program. It should make you nervous when somebody's like, I can fix all problems. You should be like, oh, okay. Show us then. It's like, great, show us that you can do that then, and then you can have all of the money. You can have it all. Go ahead. But the claim about what this could potentially do is quite enormous. And so he talks about all right. Okay. Let's take a step back. Let's take a moment. This image is what you get when you search pareidolia, by the way. The tendency to see faces where there aren't any. This is from a 2024 kind of review on some of this stuff. He says, the use of the word intelligence and other cognitive terms applied outside of its familiar context of brainy animals immediately raises questions. Might not these terms be misused? Are not morphogenetic systems simply following the rules of chemistry? Why anthropomorphize them? So he's reflecting on this, the kind of pushback that I sort of flagged earlier in this lecture of like, really, are we calling that intelligence? Are we really calling that intelligence? Should we really call that intelligence? What do you think? I don't know. Thoughts? Yeah, let me tell you what I'll tell you what Levin said. So, an uncontroversial aspect of our review is that claims of intelligence and other cognitive terms, like all others, must be based on rigorous experiment, supported or ruled out by the degree of objective benefit that a given framing affords in terms of A, prediction and control, and B, future discovery and new research program and the new research programs that it suggests. So, his answer to that question is, well, it makes sense to call things intelligent insofar as it lets you predict and control them. He sometimes talks about hackability. So suppose, go to this picture. So the bioelectric field as a map of the goal state of development. If that's true, if something has a goal state, he said, the only context in which it makes sense to say something has a goal, if you can A, figure out how that goal is represented. Goals don't just sort of float free in magic land. They have to have some kind of physical manifestation, right? They got to appear. They have to appear somewhere in the system, and that you can rewrite the goal and have the system change to go to that new goal. And if you can do those things, call that hackability. If you can do those things, then sure, yeah, call it a goal. That's what, in some sense, justifies the attribution of goal directedness to the system, if you can first identify where the goal is represented and then change that. Because, I was around in the 1990s when the Human Genome Project finished, and people were psyched. People were saying stuff like this about the Human Genome Project, which might, again, this is why I'm a little wary when people start talking like this. People were like, once we understand the genome, we'll be able to fix all of our problems. We will be able to rewrite your genome to make whatever body that you want. That was the promise. And then we got in there in the details, and it's not like we didn't learn a bunch of really interesting, important stuff about how genes help produce bodies. But it turns out, if I want to grow another arm, we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to activate all and only the right genes to change the way bodies built themselves. We don't know how to do that. It's a huge, massive, complex set of interrelated questions, and it might be very individual, like your specific genetic makeup and activation levels, and maybe stuff like bioelectric fields might mean that there's no general purpose answer to that. His claim is that might not be the right level at which to intervene. So down at the crunchy details of the genetic level, that might be such a mess that the real place you want to intervene is at the level of bioelectricity. It's the difference between, if I want to sort of teach you something, I have two options. One, I can go into your brain and rearrange synaptic weights one by one, or I could tell you things. One of those is unbelievably complex and hard, and I cannot on a practical level do it. They won't even let me try. My grant application was denied. But the other one is fairly straightforward. So his claim is, insofar as we want to, the justification for calling this intelligence is precisely that you can talk to it and have it listen and act on what you said. So change the bioelectric field, changes the goal state of development, and then the organism itself works out which genes have to be activated, in which order, to what degree, to make, say, an eye on your back. To make an eye on your back is a huge, complex genetic developmental question, but if you can speak the language of the goals of the system and change those goals, then the organism itself does that problem solving for you. Just like you, when I teach you something, your brain works out which exactly synaptic weights to change in exactly what way. I don't have to deal with that messy level of low-level stuff. I can ask you, hey, try to figure this out, and you will do all that kind of complex stuff yourself. So that's the pitch. It's pragmatic. It's a bit, you might want to say deflationary. Deflationary in the sense that you might think that having a goal is some it doesn't depend on what you care about or your interest or what you're trying to do. This makes goals relative to what can I control and what makes a good scientific research question. Those are pretty practical questions. It's no longer this grand metaphysical thing, but what is intelligence really? Now it's what is it useful to treat as intelligent? It's a much more practical version of the same question. You might be, if you were invested, like many philosophers I know, in this grand metaphysical, what is intelligence really? What are goals really? You might be a little dissatisfied with that. You say, no, I wanted an objective answer to this. I didn't want an answer that, like, oh, well, what counts as intelligence depends on what I can get a grant for. Like, oh, I wanted something a little richer than that. But I don't know. Again, if he can cure cancer, that's fine. Then he gets to decide how these words. In some sense, you have to give it to somebody who can really deliver. Supposing he does really, and this research program really does deliver the practical benefits, you might be like, oh, now this is how we use intelligence instead of the old way. I don't know. Is that thoughts or concerns about any of that stuff? Yeah.
On the previous slide, it said something about like fixing all of these things, and one of the things was listed was aging.
Yep.
What does that mean to fix aging? You saying like he'll just stop us from aging at all?
I assume, I don't know. I don't know. He didn't go into any more detail in this thing. I assume it means to increase your health span, the period in which you're healthy. There's lots of people in this, in the kind of like transhumanist biotech world who think aging is a disease and it should be cured. I don't know exactly what he means here. I don't know. Yeah.
That is likely be the thing where I knew a lot of rich people how to beat themselves from their children. These bioactors of girls, they're just like, you can find veganism, and they're just like injecting themselves with their children dogs. I forget the details that were like getting younger, they're getting them physically in bed. Right. So that kind of like one solution is kind of like stealing stuff.
I don't think I recommend harvesting the blood of children. I don't know. I'd have to look at the science, but somehow that feels suboptimal. I think the promise of this is supposed to be that you don't have to do that. Well, so you come up with ways of fighting the negative effects of aging. Hopefully you get the good effects of aging too. It's awesome. Being over 40 is like so many of my problems just went away. I used to care so much about whether people thought I was cool. It's just gone. It's just gone. It's awesome. You'll love it. But hopefully we keep the good aspects of aging and not the bad ones without having to harvest our children's plasma or whatever. Yeah.
Wait, Sherry brother.
Is it eugenics? So there's that accusation with all transhumanism. The eugenics broadly means just like shaping the kind of genetics of humanity, and it has a horrifyingly racist history. Like horrifyingly racist. Like that's the kind of Nazi thing. One of the things that you might take away from this is precisely, so recall the two-headed planarians, where you have radical transformation of the form of the animal, but no genetic change. One of the things you might take away from this is genes aren't everything we thought they were. One of the things you might think is genes are kind of the hardware that your body uses to build itself, but not the destiny that you used to think it was. And that was the real crux of genetics or eugenics, and the way that it produces the horrifying results that it did, like mass involuntary sterilization or murder. Those rise to the top of mind of like things that were bad about genetics is that it caused the murder of millions of people. That only, it's what little justification they had for that was the belief that your genetics were destiny. Your genetics determine who you are, and your genetics can't be changed. So if the argument here is, actually, no, you can make radical transformations to the kind of body that you have with no genetic change, then maybe some of the horrifying consequences of eugenics don't come along with this version of rethinking how. So I'm in favor of people being able to change their bodies. I actually quite like the idea that I think it's one of the things that's most unique about us as a species is that we make and remake our bodies. No other species does tattoos like we do, or piercings, or scarification, or any of that stuff. Every human culture I know remakes its bodies, and I think that's awesome. I think eugenics is terrible. So if there's some way of we can remake ourselves without having the legacy of eugenics, that sounds good to me. I hope that this is something like that. Keep an eye on it. Let's keep an eye on it, though. It's good to note and be like, okay, which are we reproducing some of that old eugenics stuff? I don't necessarily see it, but it is absolutely worth keeping a very close eye on in case that stuff pops back up. Good. Some thoughts? Yeah.
I feel like there's a strange tension in this with respect to consciousness. So in the sense that I feel like consciousness and intelligence are inextricably linked in the sense that when I think of consciousness, I think of kind of like a really great dexterity in terms of goal-directedness.
Yep.
If you're conscious, you can think about what it is to be yourself.
Yep.
As such, you can do many different things.
Yeah, good.
And so in some sense, I don't know if there's like a weirdness where, I don't know, I'd say at 11, sure, okay, I do think there's something with these electrical pathways such that I can make, eye grow on my back. But the distinction between the eye growing on my back and those cells and myself being intelligent is I can think of myself as a goal-directed thing.
Good.
And in that sense, have way more goal-directedness
Good.
than the thing that just merely changes because of electrical pathways.
Good. Yeah. So, I think that's a very reasonable thing to say to 11, which is like, yeah, okay, well, let's call, if you want to call, developing embryo goal-directed or intelligent, okay. But maybe that means we just need another word for what we are, which is we're not just goal havers, we are goal makers. It's like the existentialists say, you can think about your own purpose and reshape that. And isn't that something interesting and unique about human beings? And isn't that something valuable about us? We still need a word for whatever that is. And if we've hijacked goal-directedness for this much simpler thing, what do we do with that? Yes, good. I think that's certainly something that you might ask him to like. Well, I liked having goal-directedness in the conscious sense. Can you call this thing something else? Maybe you can call your thing something else because your thing is new and our thing has been around for centuries. So good. I think that's a very fair response. Good. Yeah.
If I may, I'm going to disagree with one point that you made. You said that you think consciousness and intelligence are linked. We can see like that AI is, we don't necessarily consider it conscious, but it's intelligent. Same with a program. Programs aren't conscious, but they can be intelligent.
Yep.
They had a goal. If one way of achieving that goal doesn't work, it could be programmed to find a different way or use a different method. Is that not what we're seeing here, though, more in a program rather than like inside itself communicating how can it get around its obstacle?
Good. So do you want to reply? Yeah.
You and I disagree per se. I think what I'm saying is there's a distinction between, conscious intelligence and the intelligence that Levin's speaking about. In that sense, I could say like AI has intelligence, although I don't know if large language models per se have like the intelligence that we have with consciousness. They're just really big, so they can seem like they do many things that conscious people do, right? So like AI doesn't necessarily do anything new per se. It just has a whole lot more pathways than anything else.
Good. So if we go back to this definition of intelligence, I think that AI passes this fine. It passes this thing fine. This is why it's sort of tricky to use such a stripped down definition of intelligence. It's literally just having more than one way of getting at the same thing. I think there's another, we might reasonably distinguish. So let's call this intelligence, and maybe the thing that you were discussing, which is something like understanding your own goals, reflecting on them, and actively shaping that. You might call that something fancier, like rationality or wisdom. In that, those phrases come to mind. I think what we're going to learn from in artificial intelligence over the next 5 years is this is probably a fine definition of intelligence, but how little that actually gets you. How much you need something much deeper and much more complex, like knowing what your goals are, being able to say, no, that's not a good goal for me, and I want a new goal. That capacity makes us human level functioning probably depends on something like that very, very deeply. Knowing what the right problems to even attack are is a really fancy thing that we do. And it might be that's called, we'll use words however you want. You might call that rationality or something like that. And then we can leave intelligence to this fairly simple property and describe what we have as rationality or wisdom. And I think we're going to find that these machines are wicked intelligent, and that's not enough to be a person, say. Yeah.
So that's what he's not arguing that the cells are inside of itself thinking about how can it get around the program. It's more it's been told different ways that it can get to that objective.
Yeah, I mean, So this definition of intelligence from James, note that it doesn't mention the mechanisms at all. Doesn't have to have represented the goal to itself in any explicit way. It doesn't have to have a fancy way of choosing between it. So this good, push on this, how stripped down a definition this really is. You might want to say intelligence is when you understand a goal and then you understand several ways of getting to it. Maybe we want to deny AI has that, but that's not the version we're working on here. And I don't think a cell understands, like, I'm trying to make a face. Like, seems implausible to me. Whereas usually when we talk about intelligence, we mean something like having an internal representation of where I'm trying to get and why I'm trying to get there, and then an understanding of the path, something like that. Good. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you, that was really good. That was fun. Okay, so next time, next week, don't come here because it's reading week. But after that, in this room, midterm. Thanks, everyone.